Okay, so we're going to take a look tonight at the Bible talking about transmission and translation. And like I said, that's the topic tonight. I'm not doing canon. We've already done canon before. We've talked about the canon of Scripture, how we got the books in the Bible. I've done enough talks also on the reliability of the Bible, the reliability of the New Testament. We've done that several times. I think I even did some of the Old Testament a ways back. But there's a lot of historical tests you can put to the Bible, right? But we're, the transmission translation is used one aspect of an overall case for the reliability of the Bible, right? It's one chunk, it's one piece of the chain. Okay, it's not everything. Okay, but that's the area where we're really focused on tonight. I'll talk a little bit more about the other parts later. Now, if you do want to, as I always like to do, give you resources. If you want to go deeper on just developing an overall case for the reliability of the Bible, you can get some of these books. I really like that book In Defense of the Bible in the orange cover. That's a really, really that's a comprehensive case of just so many things about the Bible. That's one of my favorite books. And I think it's accessible. Like I said, I think it's not one of those things that's so technical you can't understand it. The other ones are good too. They're all good, but I think that's one of my favorite ones there. If you want to just get into some of the canon issues, which I've done before, you can get some of these books, introductions. That talks about how we got the books of the Bible, like who picked the books that are in the Bible, how they got to us, everything. But that's not really what we're dealing with tonight. Okay. But if you do want to go deeper, you can go into that as well. There's some readings there. Of course, there's many other books which I've talked about before. So sometimes you'll talk to people, and I know that this comes up a lot over the years. There's just a general assumption by some people out in the culture that, like I said last week, they assume the Bible's been copied and copied and edited and translated and translated. And so therefore it must have been corrupted in some way. So, they might throw that out there in a conversation. And obviously, you don't want to be overly defensive. You don't have to be like, you stupid idiot, why did you say that? You want to just slow down and maybe just say, I noticed that you've asserted something here. You're asserting that the Bible's been copied and copied and copied, et cetera, edited, translated. Like, okay, I understand you kind of asserted this. That's your assertion now. Would you be able to provide maybe some evidence for it? Like, what's your evidence for this? Or you might want to say, how did you arrive to that conclusion? Okay. Just general things to bring up. Um, you also can bring up, when you say the Bible has been copying, copying. Remember, the Bible's 66 books. So you might want to ask, like, which book are you referring to? The Bible's a collection of books, right? It's not just the Bible, it's 66 books. So you may want to ask them that. They probably don't know. Many times in this case, they're not going to know how to respond to this, and you're not trying to do it to be snarky. But for the same token, there is a case for using good critical thinking skills and obviously responding and with truth and love, right? So you got to respond with truth. We always speak the truth and love. That's the goal. Now, when I say talking about like assertions and evidence, remember that people can assert things all day long, right? I mean, we assert things. If somebody in New Jersey, like Eric on the call, or somebody else says, well, that's a UFO above my house. Okay. So now I'm not saying he's saying that, but I'm saying, let's say somebody says that. Well, they just asserted something, right? They made an assertion, they made a declaration or a statement, right? Well, now the burden's on them. They're going to have to provide facts or observations that they can provide in support of the assertion, right? That's what evidence is. Okay. You got to provide a body of facts to back up your assertion. Just like if someone says, like I said, the Bible's been corrupted or it's been changed, it's been altered, it's not trustworthy, they're making an assertion. So that's what I'm asking for. I'm asking for what kind of evidence do you have for that assertion, right? People confuse these two things a lot. I've noticed that over the years, not just on college campuses, but in general in the public square, in general discussions about anything. Could be about politics, could be about the Bible, could be about science, can be about anything. A lot of people think because they assert something that makes it true. Okay, well, I just asserted something. I'm like, okay, yeah, you asserted it. I said, but what I'm looking for the evidence for your assertion. Okay, I mean, you can assert anything. You could say that aliens are going to come to our Earth in 10 years and take over the planet. You could say that China is going to attack us in 3 days. You could say Russia is going to take over Ukraine tomorrow. You could go on and on with assertions. The question is, what is the evidence you can provide to back up your assertion? This may seem like a very basic thing, but I'm telling you, I run into this all the time. And sometimes when you go on a campus, like I do, sometimes when you're talking to college students or just people in general, you get someone who's like a steamroller, they'll just keep talking and they'll just keep asserting things over and they'll just go on a rampage, like, blah, blah, blah. It's like just on and on and on, asserting, asserting, asserting. Sometimes you got to like slow them down and be like, wait a minute, let's back up. Let's back up. Let's just stick to one thing here. You asserted this over here. Can we just talk about that right there? Let's just stay on that thing. Okay. So that's really important that we do that in our conversations. So we're talking about these categories tonight, and I said also last week, sometimes people get these confused when they try to bring up the issue of the Bible not being translated or being translated and translated, edited and copied and copied. You always want to remember the transmission issue. The transmission issue it deals with how the original autographs of the Bible were copied and whether these copies accurately reflect the original autographs, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And then translation issues discusses the translation of the Bible into other languages, from Hebrew to Greek into other languages, okay? And whether the Bible in our language accurately reflects what the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts said, okay? So those are two related issues, but we want to make sure you make those, when you're talking to people, make sure they know what they're talking about. What one are they referring to, okay? Now, when someone says, just really quickly, when they say the Bible's been translated over and over, it's been translated and translated, they sometimes assume like the Bible went from Hebrew and Greek into like all these different languages, went to German and French and Swiss. And I mean, I could go on different languages, Chinese, whatever. And then eventually it made it in the English language. I mean, they just assume there's this long process of all these languages involved, but there's really not. Okay. I mean, all we do when people translate, they translate from Hebrew and Greek into the English language, or they translate Hebrew and Greek into the French language, or Hebrew and Greek into German language, or Hebrew and Greek into Chinese, or whatever it is. Okay. It's a one-step process. Okay. Not a series of steps that lead to corruption. It's one translation step from the original to English or to whatever language that person needs to read, right? And so that's something we can clarify very quickly with people. What do they mean it's been translated and translated and translated? Okay, I'm sure maybe they don't know. And like I said, you're not trying to be snarky, but you just need to point that out, okay? It is true that the books of the Old Testament, were written about 1400 to 400 BC. The books of the New Testament are written about AD 40 to AD 90, right? Jesus was crucified in AD 33, around there. And the books, the New Testament, AD 40 to AD 90, with John being the latest one there. Paul's letters are between 40 to 65 AD. But so it's true that any time or anywhere between about 3,400 and 1,900 years passed since a book of the Bible was written. That's true. It's also true that, as I'll say in a minute, that we don't have the original manuscripts, okay, in for the New Testament or the Old Testament. Okay, we don't have those. They don't exist anymore. I'll explain why in a minute. And it's true that everything we have were copied. They are copies. They're copies of copies. They're copied by scribes. We'll talk more about that in more detail. Like I said, we only have copies of copies. That means that the assumption is, of course, if they're copied by scribes, then scribes make mistakes, right? And maybe the transmission process wasn't perfect. And how do we know that what we have has been preserved accurately? Okay, so how do we know we have the words of Scripture? And That's a legitimate question. I don't have any problem with that because, if someone comes to me and says, well, the Bible, we don't have, if someone comes to me who's kind of knowledgeable and says, I know we don't have the original copies, the very original autographs, and all we have is copies. How do we know those copies are trustworthy? That's question is fine. It's legitimate. I don't have any problem with that. It makes sense. It's well worded. It's nuanced. It's fine. Um, but we one of the reasons, some of the reasons we don't possess, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons we don't, some of the reasons we don't possess any of the original manuscripts. I mean, the original autographs. Okay, the original text is what I'm referring to. Because part of it is the materials they used could disintegrate very easily over time, like the papyri or I'll show you in a minute. There were things that were written down. They used different materials in the if you look at the Old Testament, the materials they use. The New Testament is mostly papyri, but when you get into the Old Testament, there's things you find written on stone and other surfaces, clay. But we know that as far as the paper, the papyri, that obviously can disintegrate over time. It wears out. And then there's also an issue of um, the scribes obviously sometimes destroying some copies so they won't be corrupted by unbelievers. They're the people around them that didn't, they could take one of their copies and maybe corrupt it, right? And so some of the scribes would destroy some of the copies. Okay, that's understandable. And then you had some cases where, with all the exiles Israel had, all the Babylonian exile, the other exiles, it was hard to always protect some of those the original manuscripts from destruction. If you read Jeremiah 36, 10 to 23, one of those kings there actually burns one of the copies. He takes one of the manuscripts and burns it. Okay. And then Baruch, the scribe, has to make a new one or something. I mean, you'll read that right there. One of the enemies of Israel actually has it burned. So, there are human issues and just basic knowledge of what it was like to try to, preserve those issues that we need to keep in mind. So it's not like some sort of scandal or some sort of conspiracy to keep people that read the Bible today away from the original manuscripts. Now, maybe God had a reason also for not preserving the original autographs, the original text. That he could have a reason we don't know about. Maybe we'd worship them. I don't know. But we don't have them. Okay, and so that's fine. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's a disaster or anything. It doesn't mean that we can't rely on the Bible or anything. I mean, that's the way it is with a lot of things. You don't have, I mean, Muslims think they have the original autographs. That's what they don't think it hasn't been copied one time. They don't think it has no scribal copies, nothing. They just think that Muhammad recited it to this group of people around him, these certain group, and they just copied it. Or no, and they just copied it one time and that was it. And so they're gravely mistaken, but that's what they assume. Um, so yeah. So wait a minute here. I'm sorry. I may have the wrong slide. Oh, kind of repeat what I said. One of the main reasons we don't possess any of the autographs concerns the materials. Like I said, the surfaces such as papyri and parchment, which are like animal skins, are not as durable as stone tablets, right? They'd wear away after long years of use. And we need to remember, as I say, number 3 here, the original text, it's not like a physical object we have to find. Okay, we're not going to find it probably. And it's not like when Indiana Jones is looking for the lost ark, in the movie. It's not like a physical object we have to go find. The autographs, the original do contain the original text, but the original text can be contained without them because that's what we do when textual criticism, the critics that do textual criticism, that's what they do. They look at all the manuscripts they have, and then they try to reconstruct it as much as they can back to the original. That's what they do with textual criticism. Okay, that's why there's people who do it full time for a living. I'll show you some of them as we go along here. That's what they do. Okay, to try to take all the copies we have, compare them to each other, and then find out how accurate they are. See if there's a scribal, maybe there's a letter missing, maybe there's a spelling error, maybe there's a phrase, there's something in there that needs to be reconstructed or something like that. But that's what they do for a living. Okay. All right. Now, I also want to mention that if you want to study more on translation, which I'm not going to get into Bible translations tonight, that's not what I'm going to be doing. Like which is better, the ESV or the KJV or the NASB or the new NIV, whatever. I'm not going to be talking about that at all tonight. But if you want to get a couple books on that issue, those are pretty good books right there, starting places. Okay. How to choose a translation for all it's worth, and then 40 questions about Bible translation. Mark Strauss is co-author one of them. He has another book on his own. I actually had his brother, Michael Strauss, who's a physicist. He came and lectured for us here at Ohio State on the evidence for God from the universe, from the beginning of the universe and the design of the universe. So it's interesting. One brother is a biblical scholar and the other one's a physicist. Pretty interesting. So I know Michael, I've never met Mark, but they're brothers. Okay, so when you think about the First Testament or the Old Testament, what did they write on? They wrote on things, as we'll see here, such as stone, clay, wooden rods and sticks. What they use, wooden rods and sticks. They wrote on metal, as we'll see here. You can see that as gold as a writing surfaces and Exodus. You see other writings on gold, silver, copper, bronze, right, or tablets of these metals. There's broken pottery and, of course, papyrus as well. So let me show you an example of some of these. This is called the Ebla tablets. I'm sorry. These are clay tablets, and these were found in the late 1970s by an archaeologist. And you'll see, I can't read this, obviously, and neither can you, but I doubt you can. But you can see, obviously, they found things like biblical cities on here, biblical names are on there. So that's an example just of something that was written on clay, right? You can see how it gets broken, of course, right? Because clay, if it falls, it can break. So it'd be hard to preserve that, but they did manage to find that. You also have this right here. It's a bulla. It's a clay impression of a seal used to authenticate a signature, right? That's what they do. And on the left side of the photograph, it could be from something about King Ahaz himself. Maybe he's the one who's doing, had this thing made, whatever. But that's something else to do. I'm just giving an example of things they would write on or things they would put their communication on. You could see it, like a something like this. So you can see how that could wear away, though, right? But it's amazing it's been preserved. It's really amazing. And this example is something that's on some kind of stone. The Mesha Stela, called the Moabite stone. This was found east of the Dead Sea in 1868. So, it talks about the issues that happen in 2 Kings 1-3. It's that I'm just example of materials they could write on. It's pretty cool, right? No doubt about it. And then you had another thing called the House of God. I'm sure this is on clay. It's used as a receipt for the silver donated to Solomon's temple. It's the earliest evidence outside the biblical text referring to the first temple as Beth Yahweh or House of God. So just example of things they would write on. You had this one here. Some kind of stone here they've written on, obviously. Kind of interesting. So they made do with what they had, no doubt about it. They made use of the materials they had. We know that we see, as far as like a writing history starting, like, because remember, when you read the Torah, God speaks to people audibly or whatever however he does it. It doesn't really tell us. just at Abraham, God spoke to Abraham, God spoke to Moses, God spoke to certain people. We don't know whether it's just in their mind or it's outside themselves. Nobody knows because it doesn't tell us. But when God decides to start wanting things written down, he, starts with Moses, and Moses seems to, of course, you talk about the Ten Commandments being etched by the finger of God. That's what actually Orthodox Jews believe that the finger of God etched the Ten Commandments on the tablets of stone. Maybe Christians believe that too, I guess. So the point is that then you see Moses start talking about other texts, starting some sort of canon, starting a body of writing. And then, you see basically during King Josiah's reforms, the Second Kings 22:8, it says there's the book of the law found at the temple that became the basis of his reform. So there was some sort of compilation of the Torah already, right? It's, like I said, it's referred to as the book of the covenant. So Moses must have started, like I said, he started to write things down, as we know, when he compiled the Pentateuch. There's someone that obviously edited it after he was gone because he died. And the person talks about Moses' death, could have probably Joshua. But we know there's some sort of writing tradition starting, or it happened very early on. Okay. And we know that when you come to in 586, when Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, then the temple was looted, destroyed by fire. The Jews were exiled. We know that the restoration, which Ezra and Nehemiah talk about in those books, you see that there's in the book of Ezra, you see Ezra, he has a copy of the Torah and he's reading it aloud, right? Nehemiah chapter 8. And then you see from then on, you see like Jewish scribes starting to create copies of the Torah and eventually the Old Testament. Okay. Now, so the point is that there seems to be the canon, like the issue of writing things down started with Moses, but you see a something carrying on after, right, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So because Ezra's reading from some sort of scroll out to the audience. Okay, so there's something there. Obviously, he's put together. He's reading. So let's talk a little about the scribes that copied the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. That's what Jews call the Old Testament. They don't really call it Old Testament. They don't like that. I agree. I think Old Testament makes it sound like it's outdated and irrelevant. So I prefer to say the Tanakh as well. You have what's called the Sopherim scribes. They existed about 500 BC to AD 100. They were starting to copy things down and preserve, the Torah. They didn't last forever, of course. Then you had another group of scribes that came along after right around AD 70, after the Jesus movement had started, and they began to copy things down. The Tonanim, I'm sorry, I may not be pronouncing that right. I'm sorry. It means teachers or repeaters. They're another group of Jews that copied things down, scribes. And then you had another group that came along, which a lot of people are familiar with. They're called the Masoretes, called the Masoretic texts. They came along and then copied things down. Okay, and the Masoretes, basically what they would do is they added the vowels and the punctuation. They came in and they added the vowels and the punctuation to a lot of the manuscripts. Okay, and you can look at something called the Codex Leningrad, which stored in Russia, of course. That's where it is, in Leningrad, and that's the one of the most complete Masoretic texts as far as the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, we should say. Our Old Testaments are based on the Masoretic text. The New Testament, I'll talk more about what they use, but that's one of the oldest ones, the Codex Leningrad. As far as a complete Masoretic of the entire Masoretic text, Hebrew Bible, is the Codex Leningrad. So, Israel had their scribes, certainly. If you read the Talmud, the Talmud came after the time of Jesus. That's a body of rabbinic literature. There's like the Talmud, the Mishnah. there's the Babylonian Talmud. There's some other. There's this body of rabbinical literature, and in the Talmud it talks about some of the ways they had to make the copies, what the scribes had to do, and some of the requirements were that whoever copied it um, had to take a bath first. They had to be fully in all their full Jewish dress. They could only use a certain kind of ink. There was rules govern the spacing of words. No word or letter could be written from memory. Lines and letters are methodologically counted. If a manuscript was found to have even one error, it was destroyed. So if you made a mistake, you had to start over. That would be very tedious, as you can imagine. So you couldn't be sloppy and just like, just copy it down. No, there's a very meticulous method in copying. Have you mentioned this book, In Defense of the Bible, which is a great book, by the way. There's an Old Testament textual critic by the name of Paul Wegner. He wrote a chapter in this book called Has the Old Testament Been Hopelessly Corrupted? He says here the simple answer to this question is definitely not. For if the Old Testament had been hopelessly corrupted, then God could not hold us responsible for following his commands. In one sense, he says, God would have failed since the purpose for Holy Scriptures provide divine revelation. Now, this guy is a full-time Old Testament textual critic. I can't put everything he wrote here, but that's his chapter in that. He has a chapter in this book called The Old Testament Been Hopelessly Corrupted. Now, having said that, let me nuance this carefully. When I hope we understand, we talk about the Bible's inspired, okay, when we say all scripture is God breathed, that doesn't mean that when a scribe's copying something, that God is taking their hand and he's controlling their hand, okay, and he's emptying out their mind and basically overtaking them, right? Like they're not in some sort of trance, okay? When we think of inspiration, we want to think of where God is overseeing the process, and then there's a human element too. So there's a divine element, a human element. Okay, that's what inspiration is. It's not like the human element's gone. It's all God. It's not like 70% God and 30% man. We don't know there's no percentage on it. The point is that there's a human element and there's a divine element. So when you think of the human element, yes, the scribes could certainly make some mistakes. This is because poor quality of oral-ages. This is what manuscripts being copied. Some contain wormholes or became very dark from deterioration. Sometimes the scribes had to copy manuscripts under poor conditions, bad lighting, or the room temperature or something. Or maybe some scribes are not well trained. Sometimes you had to have, a better one come in and copy it. Now, I'll talk a little more about what we mean by mistakes. Everyone doesn't get freaked out, okay, as we go on here. But what Old Testament textual criticism does, this is what people do. There's Old Testament textual criticism. There's New Testament textual criticism. And Old Testament textual critics like this guy back here, Paul Wegner, he's just one of them. They come in and they take all the manuscripts and they determine what is the most reliable reading of the Hebrew text. Okay, so they look at all the copyist issues. They may find a copy that is missing a letter, or there might be a variant reading, as we'll talk more about in a minute. They'll compare all the manuscripts, okay, and that's what they do. And then if they have to reconstruct something because it's missing something or something is not legible, they will do their best to reconstruct that, okay? But we know that, as I say, number 3 here, no original manuscripts exist from the authors of Scripture, but this is to be expected since they're written on perishable materials, okay, that begin to be weared out, need to be recopied. Okay, I'll talk more about this some more. Also, if you want to go deeper on Old Testament textual criticism, if you just want to get an intro, you can get a couple of those books. Okay, they will go over all the textual issues with the copies with you, and that it's very detailed. Some of it's technical, but like I said, you don't worry about it if you don't need to know all that. But I'm saying if that's something interesting, you can go deeper on that. There's very few people in the world, there's only a handful of people that do Old Testament textual criticism and New Testament textual criticism. I mean, people that do it for a living, as far as I can see. So it's not something that many people take up lightly as a career. Now, this is an interesting question. Some people might say, why don't we have earlier copies of the Hebrew Bible? And this was in a book I have by Neil Lightfoot. And he says here, one may wonder why copies of the Hebrew Bible are late in comparison with the New Testament materials, especially so it is recalled that the Old Testament was completed several centuries before there's a New Testament New Testament book being written. The answer is not difficult to find. The Jewish scribes looked upon their copies of the scriptures in almost superstitious respect, which led them to give a ceremonial burial to any copy which is old or would become worn. Their motive was to prevent the improper use of material on which the sacred name of God had been subscribed. Remember, Jews viewed the name of God as sacred, right? There's a big deal about how you copy God's name, and that's why Jews to this day, they don't call God, they don't say God, they don't say Yahweh, they say Hashem or Adonai. There's a huge issue with how you copy the sacred name of God. Anyway, but he goes on to say here, but however noble their intentions, this ancient custom has deprived us of the early Hebrew manuscripts, which we might otherwise have, and thus has lengthened the gap between the available copies of text and the Old Testament autographs. Okay? Just something to remember. Now, something that did change how people view the reliability of the Old Testament manuscripts was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I got to see these. Looked right at this cave when I was in Israel. A lot of people have seen it. If you go to Israel, you visit Qumran, you'll see all this. The Dead Sea Scrolls were probably the most important archaeological discovery of the century. It changed the entire scope of biblical studies, changed the scope of textual criticism, changed everything. It just really, really was a huge monumental discovery. So they found these caves at about 1947, I think around 1948 in that range. A young Arab shepherd, I think he was trying to find his goat. Yes, he was trying to find his lost goat. And I think he threw a bottle into one of these caves, and that's where he heard something that was strange. And he went in and searched and found some of these scrolls, and then that opened the door to everything. That's where Qumran is located, the location, if you look on a map. It's interested, that's where it is. So the Qumran community was actually a group of Jews who broke away from they went out of they left, the temple area, they left the area where Jesus would have been and all those main areas. They broke away. And they thought that the Jewish establishment, the priesthood, and the religious establishment was corrupt. And they also thought that the end was coming. They thought they were the last remnant, the last righteous remnant, okay, that was preparing for the end of the world. So they were very apocalyptic, and they broke away, and they went out into this area, and they formed a community. They were like a purity sect. They were into a lot of purity issues. And they believed in the coming of two messiahs, possibly one priestly and one royal. You can read that in their scrolls. And that was kind of like what their community looked like when it was all put together. Now, if you go to Israel, you can walk in these areas, you can see remains of them. You can't see, everything's not put together quite, I mean, somewhat, but I don't think it's quite as clear as this picture is. But I remember walking around, I couldn't look overhead at a map, but I could, if you go to Israel, you can walk around some of these areas. But the thing that struck me was so many mikvahs that are there. Mikvahs are ritual baths, that little picture right here in the middle with the arrow going to ritual baths. They have all these different, these mikvah issues. That's for cleansing. They go in there and clean themselves of impurity. So they're really into purity. That was part of the issue, an issue of purity. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably discovered in 1947, 1948, are important because they include Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament written around 200 to 100 BC, more than 1,000 years earlier than the other manuscripts we had. So these became the earliest manuscripts we have. Okay, so when you think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you want to think that we have Hebrew manuscripts 1,000 years earlier than the Masoretic text manuscripts. Okay, so that enables textual critics to check the fidelity of the Hebrew text. Okay, so there's over 200 scrolls from the Qumran caves that have been found, and they represent every book of the Bible except the book of Esther. Now, remember, when we talk about them finding books of the Bible, they're not finding sometimes full copies or full manuscripts. Sometimes they're partial, they're fragmentary. Sometimes some of them preserve more than others. Okay. Sometimes they're small amounts. It just depends on which one you're talking about. So skip that. Like there is one of the biggest discoveries for sure, there was a complete book of Isaiah found. Okay, well, this becomes the oldest complete manuscript of any book of the Bible. That's what we call Isaiah A. There's also an incomplete book, Isaiah B. But there's other things they found, like I said, but the Isaiah one was probably the most significant. There's fragments of Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Judges, Samuel, Ezekiel, Psalms, Daniel 2:4. But when it comes to the different caves, there's different caves. There's like Cave 1, Cave 2. Like Cave 2 found fragments of like 2 of Exodus, 1 of Leviticus, 4 of Numbers, 2 of Deuteronomy, 1 of Jeremiah, Job, Psalms, 2 of Ruth. So like I said, some of these are just fragments. They're not like full copies. Cave 4 was one of the best caves because they found like 100 biblical books containing more than 50,000 fragments. Okay, and so then you had partial copies or fragments of Genesis, Daniel, commentaries on Psalms, Isaiah, and others. And Cave 5, that's another cave, produced fragments. Caves 5 to 10. By the way, you can't go in these caves or in Israel. You can't like walk in them, okay? Because I already found what was in there. They're in a museum in Israel. You can see all the Dead Sea. They're all on display there. Of course, you can read about them in the books too. There's books that have all the pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can probably find stuff online, of course. But Cave 5 produced up to 50 biblical and non-biblical texts. Cave 6 yielded fragments of Genesis, Exodus, Daniel, Deuteronomy, Ecclesiastes. Cave 7 unearthed some Greek fragments, maybe the earliest portions of 9 New Testament books. Mark 6:52 to 53. That's according to priest Jose O'Callahan of University of Barcelona. Cave 8 contains fragments of Genesis and Psalms, and Cave 9 and 10 was not very productive, okay? But the most significant thing was probably Isaiah, the Isaiah A scroll, because, like I said, this was the big find. If you compare the text of Isaiah, the scroll, to the Masoretic text of Isaiah, which was later on, right? They said it's 100% identical. Okay. So that means that the Masoretic text that we've been reading in our Hebrew that's which we get our Old Testament from, is really identical to the oldest Isaiah scroll we have now. Okay. So there are 166 words in the Hebrew text of Isaiah 53. Only 17 letters were different between the Dead Sea Scroll copy and the Masoretic text. Like I said, nearly 100% identical. So that was a huge find. Probably, like I said, one of the significant things, right? As far as the book of Isaiah. Okay. So if you just like a little timeline here. So Isaiah is written in 700 BC. Copies get found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then we have a complete manuscript later on, but the Dead Sea Scrolls copy matches the manuscript that's later on. So that means the Masoretes were copying it correctly. And of course, that's in today's Bible. All right. So just to kind of sum up there, before discovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, trying to get this bar out of the way, sorry. Before discovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they translated the English Old Testament from the Masoretic texts, that dated from about 900 AD, that's called the Elepelo text, which Codex, which is and later 1300 years from the end of the Old Testament, you can see they closed that gap by about 1,000 years. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are about 95% identical to the Masoretic text. So you can, certainly The codex, obviously, there's different codexes, but that was one of them that came later on. 5% differences due to spelling differences, word order, and minor scribal errors, which impact no major doctrine. Okay, that was pretty cool. Now, let me say something that's really important. It doesn't really matter, even if you have, even if you could really, if you can show, which I mean, that's what we're doing this call, which you can show, and it would take a lot more than this call to show this because I can't cover everything. But even if you were to show that both the Old Testament and New Testament were transmitted and translated accurately, remember that that doesn't mean what's inside the manuscripts is true. Okay. Now, obviously, we think the content in the manuscripts is true, but just showing that it's been translated, and transmitted accurately won't show that. Let me get an example. So let's say the Book of Mormon was transmitted and translated accurately. Let's say you could really trust the transmission and translation of the Book of Mormon. Well, that doesn't mean what they're translating and transmitting is true. Okay, the actual events in the Book of Mormon, the actual sayings of the Book of Mormon are not necessarily true. Okay, because the Book of Mormon is fiction. There isn't a shred of archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. So it doesn't really matter if it's just because it's translated and transmitted accurately. That won't tell you everything. Okay, that's why when you think about the Bible and people ask, if they're asking, well, when they ask him about the translation or transmission, I always say, so if it was translated or transmitted accurately, would you believe, are you saying then the Bible's true? Like, are you saying that you accept the content of the Bible, the message of the Bible? You accept the actual the events in the Bible as being true? You accept the event of Jesus' death and resurrection? Like, all these things happen? Is that what you're saying? Like, you believe they're historically, factually true? Because that's a separate question. Okay, you can have transmission and translation accuracy without an historical event happening. Okay, now I don't know. Some people record, non-factual things, and some people translate and write things down that didn't happen. But when we're asking about the Bible, we're talking about, you talk about that. You're asking, were those events, the content of the Bible, were those factually accurate? Right now, that's why you need to go to other things. Like, that's why we go into archaeology. We go into historical testing as far as looking at the events, looking at the people, looking at the history. We can do that with archaeology. There's been all kinds of archaeological discoveries for the Old and New Testament. There's been a boatload of books written about things they find. They're still finding things every day. If you go to Israel, I've been there. I've others on this call have been there probably. You can walk around and see real places from the Bible. You can walk and see, okay, this is exactly where this was, and this is here and here. I mean, we can do that. We can show the content in the Bible is accurate, the actual content, which consists of the sayings in the Bible and the events and the people, right, can be backed up by archaeology and other tests as well. Okay. So that's a separate issue. Okay. These are some books on the topic, but I'm just saying though, if someone gets into that, that's a separate issue. Okay. I mean, like I said, I'm not going to be convinced if a Mormon, just like I'll take a Muslim. Muslims are the perfect example of this. They argue and argue with me in our campus ministry when we're out and about our other team. They argue with us how well the Quran, or how the Quran's perfect. It's never been changed. It's been recorded perfectly. It's been preserved perfectly. Allah preserved it perfectly. And I'm like, yeah, so what? That's great, but it doesn't mean what's in the Quran is true. It doesn't mean the content's true, because in the Quran it says Jesus never died. It says it was someone made to look like Jesus, and he didn't really die on a cross. So that doesn't match up with what we know through archaeology and what we know through historical evidence. So that's just one thing that's wrong with the Quran, but it doesn't record events that are factually verifiable. Okay. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Okay. Okay. I also want to mention the Septuagint. So the Greek Septuagint is a translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, the Greek language, and most people at the time of Jesus were speaking Greek. That was the common language, and at Paul's time as well, same time. So God knew in his providence and sovereignty that there needed to be a translation that was in Greek. Uh, there's about 300 existing copies of the Septuagint. Um, no doubt in the New Testament that Jesus and the apostles are probably using the Septuagint in a lot of cases. Okay, they're quoting. We talked about the virgin birth about a month ago. How Matthew is using the Septuagint when he's translating the word virgin in the book of Matthew, and how he's using the Septuagint. That's just one place. So definitely the New Testament authors are using the Septuagint a lot. Now they're also using another Hebrew text, but there's a debate over that. Like, how much, what are they using here? Which when they're quoting Old Testament prophecy, are they referring to Septuagint or to another Hebrew text? Okay, what we might call the Proto-Masoretic text. There was some sort of thing the Masoretes had, or another text. I'm sorry, another Hebrew text of some kind. Okay. Um, but the New Testament manuscripts come in four categories. There's called the papyri. Um, there's been a ton of papyri that have been, well, I say a ton, about 100 of papyri have been preserved and found. Um, the These other things, are other things, the way the manuscripts come to us. There's things that are written on animal skins, right? Of course. Um, the minuscules, and then the lectionaries. So these are some of the ways the New Testament manuscripts come to us. The New Testament, as far as like talking about the transmission and translation, is a little easier, I think, than the Old Testament, to be honest. I mean, we have an abundance of manuscripts compared to other writings in the ancient world. We have a lot of their manuscripts. We can compare the manuscripts way more than Homer had, or anything about Homer or Herodotus, or Plato, or any of these, Caesar or Pliny. Some of these other ones, we have way more manuscripts and in a shorter time frame as far as the gaps of years. So when we have more manuscripts, that enables the textual critics to have a more accurate reconstruction. Okay, they have more to compare with. Okay, um, so it only helps our case. Okay, this is one of the oldest um, papyri we have, P46. That's around 200 AD. There's one that got a copy of the Gospel of John, a fragment of John. There it is, the earliest fragment of the Gospel of John, dated about AD 125. That's John Ryland's fragment. It's a fragment of the Gospel of John. But we have the least time interval between the original text and the first copies, like 30 to 300 years of any piece in ancient literature. Okay, we have the least amount of time. Okay. Um, the first complete copy we have of the New Testament, the entire thing dates to AD 350. It's called the Codex Vaticanus. I think I have a copy of that right here. Hold on. Oh, sorry, this one. Codex right here. Yeah. So this is the oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament, the end of John's Gospel. Um, and then the earliest nearly complete copy we have, the Greek Old Testament. The majority of the New Testament is contained in the Codex Vaticanus. Yeah, this is kept in the Vatican Library, of course, since the 15th century. Now, let me mention some about variants. Okay, so I talked about this. I think we did the New Testament stuff about 3 months ago. Um, when they have these manuscripts and they compare them, all the different Greek manuscripts, Old Testament manuscripts as well, um, they may discover that one manuscript says one thing, another manuscript says something different. So that we call textual variants. Okay, and the places in the text where variants appear called variant units. Okay, now, for example, they might find they may look at like this example of like six different or four different copies. They don't have the original manuscript here. They're not. They don't have. I told you those are gone, but they're looking at copies, and they may see that a copy may be have a spelling error or missing a letter or missing three letters here, and they compare them to each other. Okay, um, there's all kinds of examples of this, but the good news is that's why they have more manuscripts, they can compare them. There are, when you think of like any kind of changes in the manuscripts, there's things that they call accidental changes that the scribes have made. You have like errors of sight or writing, like I told you about vision issues. Maybe the lighting's bad, maybe they're in a location inside a cave or inside somewhere where the lighting isn't very good, so that's going to impact. They may have an accidental mistake or change they have to make. It causes them to skip something or word division or something. There's going to be an error of hearing, maybe an error of memory, errors of judgment. Those are all human things that you have to take into consideration because, like I said, inspiration involves a human element and the divine element. God is not necessarily like taking their hand and doing it for them, and he's not emptying out their brains. Then you have what we call intentional changes, where they may have to make a grammatical change, or a harmonization change, or a doctrinal correction, or something like that. Now, what I want to tell you is that if you ever want to study New Testament criticism, you want to go deeper on this, there's a guy named Daniel Wallace. He has a whole website. He is probably the foremost textual critics in the world of the New Testament. He offers classes. I think you have to pay for them, but you have to sign up. You go to biblicaltraining.org, and he has all kinds of resources here to teach you how New Testament criticism works. He'll walk you through manuscripts. You talk about what textual criticism is, what it is as a science. He's been doing it for years. He's the expert on it. He'll take you through what I just mentioned. A couple books there, by the way, you can get as well. Let me go forward here. But he can talk to you more. He can teach you more on unintentional changes by scribes, like I just mentioned before, unintentional things, confusion of letters, things like here, haplography or didiography, or all these things that most of us don't know much about. Errors of hearing, errors of seeing. He'll walk you through what those are and how much difference they really make. And then he also has a thing on intentional. Like I just mentioned, unintentional, intentional. But it's interesting that someone like this, who does this for a living and knows all the different textual issues, unintentional, intentional, knows all these issues, that he can still say that in full confidence. He says, regarding various differences between the texts, Wallace writes, no viable variant affects any cardinal truth of the New Testament. The text is certain in all essentials, and even in the most particulars, we can be relatively sure of what the autograph said. Further, in the passages in which text is in doubt, no cardinal doctrine is at stake. Now, I mentioned before, a long time ago, there's a guy named Bart Ehrman, who we had come to High State years ago and do a debate for us with another guy, but that was years ago. So he's a textual critic as well. Him and Dan Wallace have a book they've written together. But he's an atheist, but he certainly, believes Jesus was a real person. He was crucified and everything. He just doesn't think he was resurrected because he doesn't believe miracles. But this is a guy that does textual criticism for a living as well. And he even says, textual scholars have enjoyed reasonable success in establishing the best of their abilities the original text of the New Testament. Indeed, barring extraordinary new discoveries of phenomenal alterations of the method, it is virtually inconceivable that the character of our printed Greek New Testaments will ever change significantly. So there's a couple guys that say that the textual criticism endeavor has affirmed the reliability of the New Testament text. Okay, both on opposite ends of the spectrum, an atheist and a believer. Dan Wallace is an evangelical Christian, but they're both just as qualified to speak on it. Okay, but like I said, if you want to go deeper, you can get, you certainly can maybe enroll in some of Dan's classes there. He'll take you through the whole process. Okay. So when someone brings up the Bible's been changed and changed and changed, yes, there has been changes. Okay. But small changes, nothing that impact any major doctrine of our faith. They're minor things. And through the art of textual criticism, we can reconstruct everything and we can be confident that what we have in our text is was transmitted accurately. Okay, but the average person you run into isn't going to know anything about this, and they're not going to take a class in textual criticism. Okay, but you run into people that go deeper on this and do this for a living. Yeah, you're going to have to know a little more, and you're going to have to probably enroll in Dan's class or learn more about it. Depends on who your audience is. Okay, now. I also want to mention something about this telephone game objection that comes up sometimes. Some people think the Bible's like telephone game. If you guys ever played telephone game, I played it when I was a kid. You sit around in a circle, one person says one thing, if you got a circle of 10 people, and then you try to repeat it to the next person, it goes around the circle, right? Then by the very last person, you see if it's been transmitted accurately, right? If they get the same message that was started with the first person. Well, that's kind of the way some people think the Bible is. They think it's like a parlor game in which the message the message or what was supposed to be transmitted is like person whispers it in someone's ear, and then it gets to someone at the end. But that is not what the Bible is like. Okay, this is an anachronistic reading of the Bible. Anachronistic. Okay, you don't want to try to place a 21st century expectation or what you think happens in the 21st century onto a book that's written thousands of years ago, different culture, different language. Okay, it certainly doesn't resemble anything that Jesus did. Okay, it also makes it sound like whoever's transmitting it doesn't really care much about how it gets transmitted, and they don't care what the end result is. It sounds like it's kind of like you assume the Bible authors are just very sloppy, right? It's like, oh, whatever. You whisper into someone's ear, maybe we'll get it right at the end. That's not what the Bible is like. Now, it is true that Jesus was a rabbi and he taught orally. Everything's transmitted orally to begin with. We know that. It's not written down right that second. I mean, it's transmitted orally. We know that Jesus taught orally. Okay. We know that the stages of the teachings of Jesus start with him talking, right? Preaching, teaching. And then you have the period of the oral history. That's where the teachings are preserved orally. Okay. And I can say that if Jesus is your master teacher and he's your Lord, if you're a disciple, you're not going to want to just pass that along really in a sloppy fashion. It's going to be like, you know what, this is our Lord. We need to preserve what he said. And there's other people around me that can correct me if I'm wrong, but he's teaching this many, many times, repeating the same thing, short sayings, they could be memorized. And Jews memorize lots of information. They memorize the whole Testament or parts of the Old Testament. They can memorize things a lot better than we can today. But then eventually they decided that need to be written down. They said, okay, Jesus is gone. His teaching needs to be preserved in writing. We're building these communities. It needs to be passed on in writing so we can start building these communities. And so they started to write it down. And then, of course, that's how we get the New Testament. And we know that the New Testament, like I said, was written somewhere between 30, right after Jesus crucified. Paul starts to receive Jesus's teachings orally. He starts writing them down in 40 AD. And then his letters are between 40 and 65 AD. Paul's letters, they have some of Jesus' teachings in there, things about Jesus. Not everything, but some things. And then the Gospels get written down. And then, of course, the temple's destroyed in 70 AD. Then we have the book of John. But everything's orally first, for sure. It's passed on orally before it's written. But after Jesus is crucified, it's being orally transmitted very quickly. Okay. It's not hard to memorize a saying like Jesus died and rose from the dead. That's not hard to memorize. Okay. All right. So that's all I have. Um, I just want to mention, like I said, there's a lot more to it, of course. And those are just some of the basics on translation and transmission. Like I said, if you want to go deeper on textual criticism, I gave you some resources. I can't go over, you know, issues in Old Testament textual criticism, but you're certainly welcome to read on your own. But that guy is a good source right there, Paul Wegner. You can look up some of his books online as well. That book right there is a great resource. I recommend that as well if you want to get kind of like an introduction. Um, so that's about all I have. I'm sure maybe you wanted more, or maybe that's too much. I don't know, but we'll stop there and I will stop.